That I'm the last one standing between leaving this room and going for lunch or leaving Chicago. So I hope that you bear with me, because in particular this is also something slightly different from what you just heard in the last two presentations, because it's not a field experiment, it's a lab experiment, so it's much more towards the basic research style. And it's with Minish Kajabi, who's sitting there and who is happy to answer all the questions, he told me. And Andreas Niklic, who is also a junior professor at the University of Hamburg. So why is it in this session? So it's also about transparency. So basically how individual behavior is affected by the transparency of their individual actions. And we are looking at a lab experiment, and that may look a little bit artificial, so I try to put it a little bit into the context. What are we actually doing here? So you heard a lot of presentations where basically the idea was how to solicit money, how to increase the donations, etc. But when you think about public good provision, there are really two different things, at least for some public goods, like for example environmental affairs. Right? There's not just the thing that people should behave nicely towards the environment or should give money in order to save some elephants or whatever, right, what we just heard, but also that they should be discouraged to do something bad. Right? Maybe in terms of environmental pollution, don't pollute, don't drive that much, etc. So there are two different sides of the same medal, where basically you just say, okay, in order to really increase the level of the public good provision, you may try to increase donations, you may try to increase good behavior, but on the other hand, you also may try to discourage bad behavior towards the same cause. Now what we are looking at in this particular paper here is how this interacts with some sort of heterogeneities in the action space that some people may have. Some people may have really better access to a natural resource, for example. Some people may be able to pollute a lot. Other people may just be able to do something nicely. It is related to a different situation where you just say, what we just heard, I mean, there are these analysts and there are these people high up there, right? And they definitely have different income level. Right? So now if you basically make their actions transparent, you also may allow people to condition their choices, their decisions on the behavior of people within their same income group. Right? Where if you just make public, say, the average donations for this bank, right, people may have some sort of beliefs what people are doing, but they don't really know what people in their same income bracket are doing, right? And this sort of thing is related to what I will present to you, and you will see that at least in a setting where, say, one person, who we will call the special player, is able to take also from the existing public good, while other people can just contribute to a public good, that this transparency of individual people action really has a big impact. And it is, of course, up in the air. We cannot really answer this with this particular lab experiment that we have done here, how that would translate to a situation where you just have different income brackets and people may actually contribute to a different extent to a public good. So now we're looking at two different aspects. The first one I already talked about, that is transparency. Transparency basically means I can make public the total amount of money that has been collected or the total amount of the public good that is being provided, or I can really make public the individual people action. Right? The second one is called accountability. Now there's a tradition in the public goods literature, at least for lab experiments, where you say you may try to have some sort of punishment option. Usually, if in these public good experiments, there's just implicit punishment in the sense that if I'm not really happy with what you're doing, I may also just lower my own contributions, right? So this sort of downward bias over time. Then there's another literature where they introduce some explicit punishment options. You may look at that in the real world more as maybe social disapproval or something like that, where you just say, okay, now I really know what you are doing, I'm not happy with that, I try to do something bad towards you. Right? So maybe I disapprove this action and then there's some mechanism how you can actually do harm. Now in this lab experiment it will be just, I give up some money in order to do harm to you, right? So this paper now looks at this interaction between transparency and accountability, and I will go into the details in a second. Okay, so the design looks a little bit weird. So you see some formulas here. That's a typical public good experiment in a lab, right? It's sort of motivated by what you look at in the field when it just comes to contributions. So the idea is each player has some particular endowment. Yeah, you may have your income. You may donate something. Individual I gives a contribution CI. And then in the lab, the benefits from the public good are just induced in a monetary way. It's not that you really give to charity and you have some benefits from the public good that's being provided, but instead you basically receive some money from the total amount of contributions that are given by all the different players. Okay? So those is the sum of contributions by all the players. And there's here, in this particular experiment, some initial endowment of that public good. Right? So people can just add to this. Those are the, in this case of symmetric players, where everybody can just contribute. That's great, right? I mean, there's some existing public good, and now we just try to increase what is there by asking people to give some money. And the innovation, at least in that particular literature, that we are having here is that we have a so-called special player. There's 3 players who just can contribute. It's the same thing. They can contribute up to their own endowment. So basically, you can just give up a month or a year of income if you basically slide the thing 28 times, right? And then there's a special player who can also take. He basically can, in a sense, for example, environmental pollution, I can pollute or I can contribute. Right? I can sort of diminish what is there. I can take up to the initial endowment of that public good. So that's minus A. I just take everything what is there. You can also imagine a manager who has sort of access to a big chunk of money, right? And I can just hit the thing and run away, while others basically can just contribute to this pot. Okay, so we have different treatments, and that's the experimental part here. So we are interested in different degrees of transparency. I already told you about this. And we are interested in somehow different aspects of allowing for this punishment or social disapproval later if you try to relate this to a real world setting. Now the first thing is, and here we just look at the literature and do the same thing what they have been doing for the symmetric case, where everybody can just contribute. Have low transparency. People just get to know the total amount of the public good that's being provided, the sum of donations, basically. Or we have high transparency, where it's listed player 1, player 2, player 3, player 4. What did the individual player actually give to the public good? And then we have these asymmetric treatments, where we have this one special player who can take, and 3 players, standard players, who can just give. Again, we look at low transparency and high transparency. Now, in a third step, we allow for punishment. Now here, you may consider even a different level of transparency. You may say, okay, people just get to know the total amount of money that is still there or has been contributed. The second one, which we call low transparency, is you may get to know the total amount, but you may get to know the identity of the individual player. But I don't know what the analyst gave. I don't know what the manager gave, but at least I know who it is, and I can potentially punish this person. Based upon my belief that maybe this guy could take, I punish this one. Right, so that's low transparency. And here, high transparency, we really know this guy was the special player, this guy gave that amount of money, so it's really completely full information about individual people's action. The findings in literature usually is when people are symmetric, right? They have basically a symmetric action space, there's no difference in their terms of income level, etc. That knowing the individual people action doesn't really change much. I mean, we've seen that in some other papers today where some people may increase their contributions, some people may decrease their contributions. On average, not much is actually happening. We will basically see that that will be changed if we have these sort of asymmetries. When you think about social disapproval or punishment in a sense, then of course you can also expect that transparency really matters. If I have no idea who is doing what, I don't even know the identity of the individual player, and what can I do? I mean, there's no targeted punishment whatsoever. If I know who the manager is, who could have done a lot, or who, say, some small type analyst is, or here in that setting, who is a special player who could take, and I can punish this guy, it's basically potentially based on stigma. Right? I'm not happy with what the overall level of the provision of the public good is, so I anticipate that's probably because this guy took something out of the pot. Or from the presentation that we just had, if I'm not happy in the end that the total amount of money which has been raised in that bank is relatively little, I probably anticipate, maybe those who really have the big money, they didn't give a lot. Right? So sort of this negative norm is kind of related to this aspect a little bit. So it's not really clear what's going on here, but one can expect basically that if we allow people to know the identity but not the individual action, this guy may get hammered. Right? So what do we do? Now we have this lab experiment run in the experimental lab in Hamburg. Couple of sessions. This typical lab experiment, I mean, lasts around 1 hour. We have a total of 296 subjects, some studying economics, some doing other fields. Average payment is €11.50. They have 14 sessions, and they play basically 10 periods each. So it's just a completely typical lab experiment. And in the end, basically one of those periods is being drawn in order to pay people out. So now those are the average results. So just across all the different players. Now what do we see? For the symmetric treatment where everybody can just give, right? Transparency increases a little bit, but it's not significant. So it's the typical finding that we also have in the literature. Now here's this big breakdown, which is not surprising because now all of a sudden this one player can take something from the public good. And to a certain extent, this guy is doing this. Right? So that basically reduces the average decision to slightly below 1. Right? So now from just this slide, you cannot really identify if everybody just gives 1 on average, or if this guy basically takes 20 and the other people give something that makes up for his taking behavior. Now, if you make the actions transparent, right, so I really know what this guy is doing. I don't just get the information on the average level of giving, but I really can identify what this person has been doing. You see this decline, and this is significant. So in that sense here, transparency backfires. We make the individual people action transparent, and what it leads to is that there's, on average, now really taking, this guy really takes even more from this public account. And we'll see how that is important. So now if you introduce punishment, now if we have no idea who these guys even are, who is a special player, who is the other players, I mean, there's some punishment that you can observe, and it increases again those average decisions a little bit, but not really much. If I can identify the special player, so I know who he is, I know who the manager is, I know who the analyst is, even so I don't really know what the people decided on giving, we see that contributions go up. And if I really know what everybody was doing, then that allows for targeted punishment, basically, and people anticipate that, and because of that, they sort of try to avoid this punishment by increasing their donations in the first place. Now, much more interesting is to sort of differentiate this figure into the standard player and the special player. And that's basically where our results are coming from. Standard player, nothing really happens. As long as this guy cannot be punished for really his individual action. So the only, I mean, here that's the metric player, nothing. The standard players, they have the same action space as under the symmetry condition. All these bars are basically not significantly different from each other. The only thing which really helps is if I know the identity of the player and I know what each individual player was doing. Then I basically can really punish them in a targeted way. That increases this guy's contribution. Now, if you try to apply this to the real world, it needs to be something like social disapproval or something where there's some punishment that I actually can give to individual persons and which can be targeted. Now, for the special player, that's much more interesting. So now, if there's no punishment and low transparency, so people don't just receive information about the total amount of giving or taking, but not about the individual people's action. This guy is taking 10 tokens. He could have taken 32. Right? So that's 1/3 of what is there on average is being taken. So it's, of course, there's some variance. I mean, some people don't take anything. Some people take the total amount. But on average, they take 10. Now, if they know that their action will be transparent, other people will get to know how much they actually are taking or giving, then they take not the 10, but basically 20. So taking increases a lot. So transparency backfires. And to us, in the first place, that was extremely surprising. So we didn't really know what is going on here. Now, one interpretation is that under low transparency, I can sort of hide behind what other people are doing. People cannot completely identify that I'm taking actually something because there are 4 players, remember. But if I'm a standard player and I say I give 10, and I see that in total the other players give 10 as well. Now, where does it come from? It could be that, or say the other players in total give 9, easier. Right? What could it be? Now, each could give 3, possibly. Maybe one person takes 20, and the other people just give much more. But I cannot really identify taking behavior by this special player. And apparently, this is really driving the results that there are some players around who don't want to be identified as doing something bad towards the public, who don't want to be identified as a taker. Right? And if, however, they know that taking will be known anyway, then why just take 10? Let's just take 20, let's take 25. So I really can take much more. Right? It's just too attractive to me because I know my sort of bad behaviors towards the public will be known anyway. I cannot really hide and just take a little. I can just go for the full pot. And the only way to discipline this agent is by allowing for some sort of punishment. Now, what you see here is that if there's no transparency whatsoever, people can punish. I mean, he increases or reduces his taking a little bit, but if his identity at least is known, then he basically stops taking on average. Right? Even so, people don't know what this guy is actually doing, right? But they know this, you are the special person, and if I'm not happy with the overall amount of the public good, the one person I'm going to punish is a person who I think is responsible for that. That's the special player. Right? So now in your setting, it may be if people get to know what this bank in total has been contributing, right, and they're not happy with the finding, they probably say, oh, the leverage that these guys up here have, or these high earners have, is so high, so probably they have not given enough. Right? And maybe that's also a similar reason for why you basically find under this kind of transparency that you have, that these guys really increase their giving in order to avoid this public knowledge of the bank being displayed in a bad fashion. So the results, just to sum things up, high transparency without punishment backfires, and that's because of this asymmetry in the action space. Right? So people really take more. It doesn't do anything to the contribution of the standard agents. Punishment improves upon the whole thing. It's great, in particular if it's targeted. So there needs to be some sort of transparency. Without that, it doesn't really help much. And for those standard agents, it really needs to be both. Right? So there needs to be transparency and punishment option in order to increase their giving behavior. Now, what are the reasons? Just very quickly. Now, interestingly, as soon as I make individual action transparent, those standard players appear to decouple their behavior from what the special player is doing. So they really look at the average behavior of people of their own type. And I think that might be some overall lesson also to learn, and which could be applied probably in a different setting. So now if I make, for example, public not just the individual or the overall decision in the bank, but say, okay, on average, the analyst gave that much. On average, those vice presidents, whatever, gave that. Right? Then it potentially also allows to people to just look after their own subgroup and to condition their own behavior and the norm, basically, that they try to pursue on that particular group. And this is what we find in this lab experiment. And we have the stigma result, basically, that if I believe that this person is special, right, and then just hammer him, and he's going to be punished. Right, so what we find overall is transparency and accountability work via two different channels. Transparency appears to be backfiring because if some people can take, they may actually take more if they will be identified as a taker anyway. Nice thing is that the standard agents are just unaffected by this because they just look after people of their own type. That's great. We have this stigma effect that if I'm going to punish, I'm punishing the guy who I think is most likely responsible for the low amount of the public good that I observe. That will be the special player. And the overall lesson that we basically have is that just making actions transparent may not really help, right? Because it may actually backfire for some of the players. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Yeah.
So if I'm into transparency treatment and I do not take, people will see that, right? I can choose not to take.
Yes.
So could you interpret your result in terms of crowding out? In the sense that, so if I know that there's some justice out there, I can take the risk of being nasty because it's a sort of self-justification effect. I know that, so I may feel bad if I do something wrong and there's a chance that nobody catches me.
Yeah.
But if the mechanism to catch me is there, then there's no reason why not to take it because there's...
Possibly. I mean, I believe we cannot really distinguish between those two different interpretations, right? So, I mean, here, yeah, I mean, it's sort of just people appear. I mean, who knows? I mean, at least the data is consistent with some sort of motive that they don't want to be identified as a taker. So they hide their own action behind this. They just limit their amount of taking. Yeah. And if they are going to identify, okay, then just go for it.
What I'm trying to say is that if that treatment reduces guilt aversion, because you get caught, so you feel less guilty if you, and so you take more.
Yeah, possibly. But it needs to be driven by some sort of self-image concerns, or by some wrong beliefs that the others may actually reciprocate in a negative fashion, right? Because what we find is that they decouple their own behavior, right? So this sort of limited taking doesn't really help, apparently, this person, because the others sort of decouple their own action. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure this is sensible, but I'm thinking about if you ran the same experiment with a different MCPR, would you get similar results?
It's unclear. I mean, basically, one could introduce heterogeneities on different levels, right? It could be the different MPCRs, it could be just different endowments that people have, right? Different income levels, for example. And how this now interacts with what we find is not clear. I mean, the interpretation that we are having is really that I limit my taking behavior. That appears to drive things here. But in terms of transparency, I would believe that we should probably find something similar, that people then are able to condition their behavior on people's behavior of their own type. And I think that probably should be found.
I'm not sure, but what prompts it is a lack of coffee maybe, and the last talk, but also the idea that you affect the relative cost of taking and therefore the image motivation versus the private motivation.
Yeah, could potentially be. I mean, here, I mean, it is sort of consistent, also this decoupling behavior from something like, I put myself into the shoes of the other and say, I probably would do the same, so why should I punish this guy? It's not nice, but okay, who am I to say this guy should be punished for this behavior because I probably would do exactly the same thing. Right, so now if I have different MPCRs, I also mean, okay, this guy benefits much less from the public good. Probably if I would be in this person's position, I would also contribute less. Right? And this sort of gives this justification then for accepting this sort of behavior and just looking after those people who are basically having the same benefits as I have. Yeah?
As more and more information goes online about how much we give to who at what time, would that sort of transparency, would that create like this zero-sum game that we see in charitable donation? Or is it the case like in Thailand? I remember a famous tennis player, because they put all their tax charitable donations online, and this famous tennis player did not donate anything in the year, totally vilified, victimized, and then he donated about $1 million in the next month. So are we seeing that this type of approach where more information goes online about giving,
right,
that is going to actually increase the sum, or will it just redistribute across people?
I cannot really say anything to that based on those findings. We just don't know. We had a couple of presentations where basically some people increase, some people decrease, and this could actually happen, right? But again, this usually happens if you are in a very symmetric world, right? I mean, then it's kind of clear that I can just observe what other people are doing on average, and I can condition my behavior on that thing. But as soon as there's some reason to do something different from others, I may just use this as an excuse, or I may feel the obligation to give more because I earn more. So and for that reason, it's not really clear how that's playing out. I mean, there is sort of this literature on something called a self-serving bias when it comes, for example, to the interpretation of different norms. And of course, in particular, when, for example, people have different income levels, but benefit in exactly the same way from the public good. It's not really clear to what extent this different income level really should be then displayed in different sort of donations. Should they basically give the same percentage, or should it, in absolute amount, should I just give something more according to my higher income level? And there may be different norms in place, and I may always just use the norm that is actually benefiting me.
Cool. Great, thank you very much, Andreas.